Joining me now is Principal of Trilogy Advisors, John Sitilides. John, thanks for being here.
Pleasure to be with you.
All right, John, before we even start in on the Mediterranean vacuum and that whole topic, let's touch on what happened yesterday in Orlando, Florida at Pulse, a well-known gay nightclub. 49 people were shot and killed by Omar Mateen. Newt Gingrich yesterday talking about it called this terror attack, an act of war. John, was it?
This act of war was declared on the United States and the West several years ago, Liz. Yesterday's was just the latest phase of this war. And it really began when the U.S. and the West collectively allowed Islamic State to establish a caliphate in the vacuum in northeastern Syria and in northern Iraq. The U.S. pulled forces out of Iraq several years ago. When the Syrian civil war began, we really had a very feeble response, haven't really taken any strong sides here. And in that vacuum in the Middle East, Islamic State has appeared, and by establishing a caliphate, and now establishing branches of that caliphate in Libya, in Egypt, and in Nigeria, they have emboldened radical Islamist sympathizers in that part of the world, across Northern Africa, and now we see, of course, in Australia, in Europe, and unfortunately again in the United States. And as long as this caliphate is allowed to exist militarily and politically, and to bombard social media with 10, 20, 50,000 social media posts a day, brainwashing people and trying to win them over to join the caliphate or to undertake attacks at home, as in Florida or as in California several months ago, we are going to have a state of war with Islamic State and its offshoot organizations, unfortunately, for a very long time to come.
And John, we heard nothing of this sort. We heard none of these kinds of explanations, none of this kind of analysis from President Obama when he spoke yesterday early afternoon. He said nothing about ISIS, let alone, he did call it an act of terror, but he said nothing about ISIS, nothing about radical Islam. He said nothing about the vacuum in the Middle East. What do you expect from him? Is he just going to treat this like it was a lone wolf attack, like it wasn't attached to anything greater, it wasn't attached to an enemy of our nation?
It's unfortunate that beginning with the White House, but if we're honest about this, really going into the political leadership of the United States, so many of our political leaders have so much difficulty drawing a distinction between Islam, most of whose adherents really have no interest in any of this and abhor many of this, and radical Islamism or political Islam, which states to impose a caliphate or to impose Sharia law wherever its adherents reside. And we have to draw that distinction. Our political leaders have to step up to the plate, educate the American people, and build up support in our country, for military measures needed to utterly destroy Islamic State where it exists now, in the Middle East, in Northern Africa, in Nigeria. It has to be physically eliminated and exterminated, but also to undertake a very strong FBI-led process here in the United States, whether it's sting operations, working with our friends in the Muslim community who can help to root out some of the most dangerous extremists in their midst and tackle it on both ends. And it begins with the White House, and unfortunately there are too many political leaders, Democrats and even many Republicans, who are afraid to address what is at stake here. And it's going to have long-term consequences, I'm afraid.
Right, and John, before you mentioned, I think, a very important aspect of this, and this is the propaganda online, the radical Islamic propaganda online. That's recruitment, it's social media accounts, whether it's Twitter, Facebook, forums, what have you. What role does the federal government, what role does our government or the FBI, what role do they play now in identifying and eradicating that, or what role should they play so that this does not continue to infiltrate our country?
Well, this is the great question, Liz, and this goes back to post 9/11 and the great debates we had in the United States about security and freedom, as if somehow this is a binary issue. We can have security for the American people, and we can have our freedoms. Most of us have given away almost all of our private information to Facebook and Google and Amazon and Apple already. If we're able to allow for responsible government officials to use what they think are very suspicious activities. And we had this debate 10 years ago, and unfortunately, I think the good guys lost it. And now we're very much on the defensive, where we basically hamstring the ability of federal authorities, whether it's Homeland Security, whether it's the NSA, whether it's the FBI, to connect the dots. when there are people who are attending certain mosques where we know that we have the most extremist, radical, violence-endorsing imams who are tied to the Wahhabist cult or Salafists in the Middle East, when we see that they are constantly going through the kind of social media displays that are out there in Twitter and on Facebook, when they are regular subscribers to the online magazines that are published, beautiful magazines, the highest quality by Islamic State, and they're regular readers. Can people begin to scratch their heads and ask people what is happening here, or ask around the neighborhood with informants and the like? So there are ways to do this. We actually did this rather effectively against communism for decades in the United States. And we're under the naive impression that with the defeat of communism 25 years ago, that we don't have any other type of internal threat that we can deal with through criminal investigations and the processes that also protect the rights of every American citizen. So there's a way to do this militarily in the Middle East. There's a way to do this through law enforcement and investigations here in the United States. What unfortunately seems to be lacking is the kind of strong-willed political leadership to bring all of this together, secure America, and keep us free at the same time.
Right, and if I'm not mistaken, much of this information online that you're talking about is public information. Most people's Twitter accounts where they interact with different people aren't protected. They don't have their tweets protected. You can just scrape the web publicly to get that information. The same with Facebook, or imagine these magazines like Al-Qaeda's terrorism magazine where they teach you how to make bombs, teach you how to attack the West. That's something that's already associated with a terror organization. It's not against the ethics or the privacy of American citizens to hack into that to see if there are American citizens associated with that. But John, let me ask you this. You talked before about the vacuum created in the Middle East that allowed ISIS to grow into what it is now. We were talking earlier, you've recently written about a similar vacuum that's being created in the Mediterranean right now. Does that pose a similar danger?
Absolutely, Liz. It's all tied in together. And if you look at the fact that we have chaos in the failed state of Libya after the NATO-led campaign several years ago to topple Gaddafi, we have a very difficult struggle within Egypt between secular authoritarianism and radical Islamism in the form of Muslim Brotherhood. We have obviously the Syria and Iraq vacuums that Islamic State has very successfully filled. And we also now have Russia playing the dominant military role in the Middle East when once the U.S. did. And we even have Iranian ships coming into the Mediterranean Sea. We have weapons coming into Hamas in the Gaza Strip. And we even have the Chinese now who are evacuating their own workers, as they did in Libya back when we had the NATO-led campaign. And they're also establishing a major military base at the southern point of the Red Sea between Egypt and the Arabian Peninsula. So we have this vacuum of power as a result of what I think, unfortunately, is a U.S. withdrawal of not just political or military, but also political leadership in the region. And many of our adversaries and our outright enemies, beginning with the Iranians, are taking full advantage of these opportunities. And interestingly, there are a number of creative ways to begin to address some of these issues, but I haven't seen much strategic thought given by the administration to plugging some of these holes here that not only would solve the problems that we are currently going over, but also some of the issues that go to the root of the Islamic State and larger radical Islamist terror problem that we have throughout the Middle East and Northern Africa.
Right, and history repeats itself. We're still reaping the repercussions, if you will, this terror attack included, of creating a vacuum in Iraq and Syria. We certainly don't want to allow that to happen again, and it seems like naivete on the part of President Obama and his administration to ignore this right at the same time that we're suffering from these attacks.